Hey, Modus. We're going to pick up with yellow journalism. I want to remind you what yellow journalism is. It's this mirror image of uh, muckraking. The idea, of course, being that it hits the reader in the emotional gut. Here we see one of William Hearst's newspapers. You see the Maine blowing up, a guy flying through the air, another one burning to death down here. Yellow journalism gets its name actually from one of William Hearst's newspapers. Uh, Hearst newspapers were the first to have have color comic strips. One of its characters was a character called the Yellow Kid. Here you see the Yellow Kid in one of the comic strips of the time. You can see it's got color comics in it, including a racist caricature of a Chinese person and a racist caricature of an African American. They became huge sellers because they had color comics, and so people would buy these these newspapers, and the name yellow journalism stuck. Yellow journalism hit readers in the emotional gut, but unlike muckraking, which was true, yellow journalism didn't pay attention to the facts. So they had sensational headlines, but misleading stories. In this case, Hearst and his competition, which was Joseph Pulitzer, would have these elaborate stories that really didn't necessarily have any truth to them. For instance, he would talk about the stories coming out of Cuba with stories about Spanish soldiers who were raping Cuban women, but there was no actual facts to back these stories up. Hearst actually sent Western artist Frederick Remington to Cuba to draw sketches of the atrocities. And when Remington got there, he said, I don't find it. I can't find any evidence of this stuff going on. And Hearst is reported to have said, you supply the pictures, I'll supply the war. We don't know if he actually said this or if this is just the story that's come down in history, but it really kind of you get a sense of the kind of man that Hearst is, that if he actually did say this. Regardless of what happened, we know that Hearst newspapers really did put out stories that got Americans calling for war. Between the yellow journalism and the Delhomme letter, which you'll read about in 10-2, Americans were ready for war. And when war does break out, ironically, it's not in Cuba, which was, of course, where we expected the Spanish-American War to begin. It doesn't actually break out in Cuba. It actually breaks out in the Philippines. In this drawing where you see U.S. ships taking on the Spanish Navy, it's not in Cuba that this takes place. It's actually in the Philippines. The war for Cuban independence didn't start in Cuba. It began in the South Pacific. Why? Because seeing that war was likely, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at that time, Theodore Roosevelt, ordered Commodore George Dewey to leave neutral Hong Kong and start moving towards the Philippine Islands. They actually arrive in Manila Harbor days after war was declared, so it was just kind of a fluke. They arrived in the harbor days after war is declared, and because of that, Dewey is able to destroy the entire Spanish fleet. He takes them by surprise without any real damage to the U.S. ships. In fact, throughout the course of the war, only 10 U.S. sailors and 6 Marines died. So when you look at this drawing, it's not really propaganda. Our ships, which as you can see are very, very modern in comparison to the older Spanish ships, which explains why they are able to wipe them out. We destroyed the entire Spanish fleet with hardly any damage to our own ships. Again, for those of you taking notes, you can pause it on this one. We are able to destroy the entire Spanish fleet without any real damage to our ships. But Dewey doesn't have enough forces. He doesn't have that many men. He can't take the entire island where the Spanish forces that are not ships, he can't take all the mainland forces himself. And so he's forced to blockade the harbor You know what that, I hope, in case you don't know what that means, he blocks the harbor so that the Spanish can't get reinforcements, and he waits for reinforcements himself. And then he does something that has the potential to be wonderful, but ends up being a mistake. He ends up entering into an alliance with Philippine rebel leader Emilio Aguinaldo. And while Dewey is in Spain, while Dewey is keeping the Spanish from receiving supplies, the Filipinos are engaging in guerrilla warfare against the Spanish until they give up. And the idea is, he says, if you will partner with me to the Filipinos, you'll get your independence. And there were a lot of Filipino rebels. They wanted their independence from Spain, and this was a perfect partnership. There's just one problem. The Spanish do not want to surrender to the Filipinos, and Dewey messes up. Dewey makes a mistake, at least morally or ethically, we might say now, because instead of actually following his word, when the Spanish come to him and say, we want to surrender, but we don't want to surrender to the Filipinos, we want to surrender to you, he arranges a mock battle behind the Filipinos' back and allows a fake battle, in other words, and then allows the Spanish to surrender directly to him, which means the Philippine Islands will now come to us and not go to the Filipinos themselves. The Filipinos think we have betrayed them, which we have, and Dewey then reneges on his promise. He says, I'm sorry, guys, we're keeping the islands for ourselves. Why? We wanted an empire. Why? Well, because we're also racist. Why? Because we were strong enough to do it. They were weaker than us. But remember hubris, remember that arrogance that I talked about? It's going to come back. It's going to bite us, because the Filipinos will not take this lying down. We'll get to that later, though. For now, the war is going to move on to Cuba. Before we do that, we need to examine, I have to remind you, or I have to tell you about one law that gets passed. Before the United States goes into Cuba, Congress passes a law to make sure that we know we're not imperialists, at least not when it comes to Cuba. Congress passes a law called the Teller Amendment, which says if the United States intervenes in Cuba, if we go into Cuba, we will not take over the island of Cuba. If we go into Cuba, we will make sure that Cuba gets its independence. That's important. Remember the Teller Amendment. So, after word reaches the United States of Dewey's victory, when President McKinley's call for volunteer troops is made even more unnecessary. We were already angry because of the Maine, but now that we know the Spanish are that easy to defeat, everybody is lining up to fight. After training in Tampa, Florida, 17,000 U.S. soldiers land near Santiago, which is the base of Spanish troops. The U.S. troops included many African Americans who are anxious to bring independence to the Cubans, many of whom were of African or biracial heritage. Fighting on the island of Cuba begins on June 6, 1898, and that's important. Not because I'm going to ask you to remember the date, but only because I want you to remember how short this war really is. One of the most famous units of the war was a volunteer cavalry or horse unit called the Rough Riders. They don't actually even bring their horses. They train on these horses, and then when they get there, they realize, we don't actually need these horses. They are commanded by Teddy Roosevelt, or Theodore Roosevelt, who actually resigned from his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and volunteers to form his own volunteer unit. It would be like you and I deciding as a group, hey, let's all join the Army, but we're going to all join together and form our own unit, and I'll command us. They don't do that kind of stuff anymore. It's made up of cowboys from the West and polo players, rich polo players from the East, not a group that you would normally assume would mesh well together. This group fought at two big places, the Battle of Kettle Hill and the Battle of San Juan Hill. Truth be told, they're not very effective. Why are they remembered? Well, because Teddy Roosevelt brought along his personal biographer, and this guy followed him around and reported on things and made them end up looking and reported back all these stories and made them look really heroic. If they weren't that heroic, who were the real heroes? These men. The black soldiers who made up the 9th and 10th Cavalries, the so-called Buffalo Soldiers of the Wild West. While the Rough Riders and others got the press, the group that actually made a difference in the Spanish-American War were African Americans. There were several all-black units, and at the Battle of Guasimas, and also at San Juan Hill, the 9th and 10th Cavalries took heavy casualties for the Rough Riders. They possibly even saved them from being wiped out. They also were responsible for the Battle of San Juan Hill being won. What kept us from acknowledging them at the time? We didn't want to admit that black soldiers were actually better than white soldiers. Why were they? Well, because while these rich polo players and cowboys, were very undisciplined, the 9th and 10th Cavalries these guys had been disciplined soldiers for 10 years or more during the Indian Wars. They'd been fighting for a long time, and they were used to it. They'd been disciplined. They'd been trained. They had white officers, I should mention, because they were not allowed to lead themselves. There's some other things that are problematic, but we'll talk about that in class. But remember the 9th and 10th Cavalries. The last thing that I want to mention is the end of the war. The San Juan Hill battle, which was one of the first infantry battles, also proved to be one of the last. 2 days later, the Spanish fleet tries to break through the blockade at Santiago and return to Spain, and the result, they were destroyed too. So we have now wiped them out in 2 different naval battles. The U.S. turned their attention to Puerto Rico, where Spanish forces were so weak that the U.S. forces compared it to a midnight cruise. When we land in Puerto Rico, they think it's like a holiday. That compared to Cuba, which was pretty easy going in naval terms, Puerto Rico is a breeze. There is one thing that's bad, though, and that is the actual toll on the fighters, or on the soldiers. Only 385 soldiers died in actual fighting in Cuba, but another 5,000 died from malaria, yellow fever, and tainted food. Remember when we talked about the Meat Inspection Act? Well, this is one of the things that was bad. The tainted food that we talked about. They were eating poisoned meat. Another thing that I want to mention, African Americans were ignored at best, insulted and discriminated at worst. They were not served food in restaurants. They were not allowed ashore for leave. In Tampa, they were forced to stay inside the barracks and inside their training areas. They could not go into Tampa on shore leave because it was assumed that if they were allowed into Tampa, that black soldiers would assault white women. It was that myth that we talked about of African American men not being able to control themselves around white women. It's disgusting how black men were treated during this time, especially when they were fighting for their country. So that's where we're at when it comes to the Spanish-American War. Thank you for listening. We are now done with all 3 lectures. Please make sure that you've got the stuff in bold from all 3 of these lectures, and you've had a chance to do this, because when we come to class on Monday, we're going to be using all 3 of these things to do some stuff in class. Hope you had a good weekend. Thanks.